So the first session in this last piece of the day is a case study Panorama session. It's going to be moderated by Greg Spicer, co-founder and CRO at Ostrich Cyber-Risk. And alongside him, he will have expert FAIR professionals in the form of Rob Moore, VP of Technology Risk at Mastercard, and David Steng, Director of Cyber Risk and Economics at Fresenius Group. So please help me in welcoming him to the stage.
Check, there we go. Good afternoon. It's always fun to have the last panel of the day while everyone's just trying to stay awake, so we're grateful that you're here. And thank you to the FAIR Institute and C-Risk. This is beautiful. As you can tell, I'm not from here, but from far away in California, but this is a beautiful place to be. So you've already heard my introduction, and I'm gonna just let the experts do a lot of the talking today. So I'm gonna start by letting David introduce himself, and then go to you, Rob, and then we'll kind of kick into it.
Thanks, Greg. Does it actually work? Do I need to get closer? Okay, cool. I made sure to wear exactly the same outfit than on this picture here, so that you can actually recognize me. My name is David. I do work for a healthcare organization called Fresenius. It's a medtech, pharma, and hospital business. And my colleagues often call me the cyber CFO because my role is actually to translate cyber matters into business jargon, which is in most of the cases finance. So together with my team, we are quantifying our strategic cyber risks. We are trying to derive the most effective cyber investments, and also, and this is probably where the term is then coming from, we're managing the cyber financials for the group. And besides my corporate role since last year, I do have the pleasure to also co-chair the FAIR Institute Germany chapter together with Sebastian. Give us a quick hand raise here. And also Gideon Knocke, who cannot attend today.
Yeah, thanks very much. So my name's Rob Moore. I'm from Mastercard, as was introduced earlier. I also run a FAIR chapter, a London FAIR chapter, and I also sit on a standards committee of a new body called the Cyber-Risk Institute, which has a standard of standards called the Profile, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. But yeah, so I've been running basically a security risk assessment group in Mastercard for the last 3 or 4 years, built it up from scratch pretty much. And my background is pretty much all payments and all risk management. So I've been doing it my whole career in operational and security basis, moving from quantitative approaches to qualitative approaches, back to quantitative approaches again, and I've taken the red pill now and fully on board on the FAIR approach.
Great, thank you. So we're going to get right into it. A couple things. One, I failed to mention too. Actually, we're starting a FAIR chapter in Southern California, which is from Los Angeles down through San Diego. So you'll be seeing some of that come out here in the summer. And one last thing is we wanted to make this, especially since it's late in the day, we wanted to make this an interactive session with you as well, and not just hold the questions till the end. So nobody will be offended if you ask a question or raise your hand or say that's not a good answer, but I'm sure it will be a good answer. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Rob. So you adopted FAIR early on at Mastercard, and I think what's so valuable about these types of discussions is giving real-life examples, not only of how it's working, but how you implement it and so forth. So you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So yeah, we were sort of, I was within a security GRC function when I first joined Mastercard, and we were kind of playing around with the FAIR concepts and how we could leverage it. And we as a whole team were pulled into a new technology risk function for the organization. And we took the opportunity to base our entire program around the FAIR methodology, and there were real ups and downs from doing that. But what it did provide us was with a baseline structure for how we build capability within the teams, this is what we mean by certain concepts, as Jack had mentioned in his presentation. You know, there are so many different terminologies and also lots of different people who call themselves risk managers but actually do completely different roles in different ways. So it allowed us to baseline that my part of the technology risk group was building a risk assessment capability, and we're going to use it. This is what it means to do a risk assessment. This is how these are the steps that you take, and we began without actually quantifying the risk at all, and just using the taxonomy of FAIR. And then when people were comfortable with, you know, with some of the terminology, we then started introducing, first in the background, a sort of 3-point estimates to certain components, and then eventually we started providing the real dollar value outputs to risks. And so that was extremely that approach allowed us to sort of build up, and we moved pretty much from, I think there was 2 of us at the beginning, and then we had about a team about 14 who globally in St. Louis, Missouri, New York, London, Belgium, and Pune, all conducting a schedule of risk assessments. And that's, again, back to what Jag was saying, we kind of got to the point where we had a sort of a backlog of risk assessments. We had demand for them. But as ever, they then reorganize. And I'm now within a second line of defense function within Mastercard. The team who I've built are still there, but they've moved back into the security function. And we have a whole new set of stakeholders. And I think the key message that I have here is that evangelizing the approach doesn't end. You need to keep and we have a whole new set of stakeholders to convince now. And we built a kind of unscalable model to a degree. It's a model based on skilled experts who can do FAIR assessments. And now we need to build automation into it, which you'll be glad to hear, Greg. Will be so we can speed the assessments up and scale it to different types of risk managers, not just people who we've classified now as specialists in risk quantification.
So with that, we're going to get to David in just a sec. I want to ask one question on this, because then, David, you can share basically your same experiences or similar experiences you've had as Rob. You went through this process of getting people on board with CRQ, with FAIR, and now you have to do it all over again, basically. What were the challenges that first go around that you might be able to learn from to make it easier the second time around?
Yeah, so as I said, you know, sometimes when you look back, you can filter out all the challenges you had along the way. But we did, of course, we had a number of challenges. We had a number of challenges with people thinking it was too complicated, others who thought it was not complicated enough because they were in the credit risk department or they were quants in their role and were asking very detailed statistical questions, and so we cut through all that. I think the biggest challenge was, and remains to a degree, just gaining the data to be able to repeat. We had a lot of churn where we were gathering the same data continually over and over again, and it's taken us 2-3 years to sort of build up a library of, as a example, you know, if Mastercard has a data loss event in Europe, and we face a GDPR fine, that's going to be the same no matter what business unit or asset we're doing a FAIR assessment on. So if we can sort of classify it, and then we could build a 3-point estimate range around that loss event or that loss magnitude, that secondary loss, to be more specific, then we can reuse it. But how we do that was a challenge. It took. We kind of felt like we needed to revalidate that every single time we did the risk assessment, even though the analyst doing it kind of knew, well, we've been doing this over again. So ways of speeding up the process has been one of the key things, challenges.
That's good. That's good. David, so different industry, I'm sure some of the same challenges and some of the same benefits. Do you want to share a little bit about what's going on and how you've been doing?
Absolutely. And that's indeed the interesting fact, right? We are working totally different industries, healthcare, finance, but we do have the same approach, the same challenges. And I believe that's also one of the key points to make here, that it's important to understand the fundamentals of risk quantification following with the FAIR framework. Because it allows you to simply think critically about your business. What is really worth protecting? What should I be focusing on? And then the rest will follow according to your respective risk profile, which is then obviously different in our organizations. So when we started and we are, I mean, this is also now the regulatory part here again, because the healthcare industry is obviously probably 10, 15 years behind the finance industry when it comes to regulation. So we started to build our cybersecurity function quite late in the process, so just 6, 7 years ago. Actually formally appointed or established in 2020 only, so 4 years ago. And back then we had the challenge, as we were set up as kind of a holding organization with 4 mostly independent business units. How do we actually start? Like, what is our starting point? Because there was like limited to no understanding about our actual cyber risks. In fact, mostly back then, cyber risk was even not considered at all or considered as a technical risk. And so we had to start somewhere. And that was the time when also, let's say, FAIR came somewhat gradually over to Europe. And we started to experiment with that, to run our first assessments, to get some consulting support also, to run, let's say, our top-down assessments on some corporate functions to begin with. To really see how we can derive the value from risk quantification. Then over time, as we built the cybersecurity function, we also built the cyber risk function for the group, and we made sure to embed the fundamentals of risk quantification into the organization, into our processes, so that we can now basically report on our quantitative cyber risk on a biannual basis, and showcase basically the evolution of our value at risk to our senior leadership.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We talked to, quite a few customers in the States and here in Europe as well. And the idea of risk quantification is new to the cyberspace per se. And to get the people in this room obviously understand and understand the value of it. And as Jack alluded to earlier too, there's so many moving parts, that the heat map and the different numbers that we're using from a qualitative standpoint, although valuable, make it very difficult in the CRQ space. So the idea of simplification in some way, shape, or form is very critical to this, especially as you're talking to perhaps a CISO who, dipped their toe in this but don't really feel comfortable about it. What are some of the benefits that you guys would you parlay to them and say to them to do this, and why to do it?
Yeah, well, this is, I've said this before, but I've really positioned FAIR almost like a superpower, where once you have a simple, structured approach to break down the components of a risk into, and that isn't something that you've just come up with, but there's a community, us, there's a standard, there's a book, there's training, there's and hopefully in the future a growing community of people, and you can recruit people in and so on. That adds huge value, because as I said in my intro, I kind of dabbled with risk quantification right at the beginning of my career with building Bayesian network causal, and it was just could not. I just could not scale it. I could not get anyone else to understand it. I barely understood it myself. Although I understood conceptually, and I kind of went completely back to let heat maps, at least we can communicate and provide a qualitative approach. And it was only with FAIR that we were able to then bring back in, and the quantification isn't why we're doing this. The quantification is just a forcing function for us to think about the different components of the risk in each way. And people get I'm sure we've all experienced calibrating a 3-point estimate, and people get very concerned and worried about what they're signing themselves up for by saying a certain factor is X, Y, Z. But I always just end the session with, by the way, we've just been doing risk management for an hour. And that, that is, we've been having debate, discussing, testing our own assumptions for an hour. That is the value we've gained from. We've all walked away with that different perception. The number we come up at the end is, useful, but it's not the only value proposition for using FAIR.
David?
Fully resonates with me, obviously. Maybe to add just a couple of thoughts. So budget defensibility is probably one I would like to add, because showcasing the risk, especially in quantitative terms, allowed us really to significantly increase our budgets in specific business units where we are now fully operating our risk quantifications, because it's simply much more tangible to talk about the financial impacts, as it just easier to relate to than a red bubble or whatever on a heat map. Also, I believe prioritization of measures, that is still something that we're working on to improve and whatnot. But let me maybe also share an anecdote about another advantage that I do see, which is about communicating cyber risk. Because especially as I just mentioned, with the heat maps, it's always difficult. You show something and no one can really relate to that. And when I presented one of our first risk quantifications, I don't know, must have been 2018, 19-ish, of our corporate functions, top risk scenarios, to senior stakeholders, I got immediate pushback. I was like, okay, what's happening here? But then obviously I could use the FAIR methodology to say, hey, okay, where do you believe the numbers are wrong? Is it on the loss event frequency side? No one actually goes that route because no one can actually argue on that side. So it's mostly on the loss magnitude side. So okay, let's drill down. What are the impact drivers? And so you can actually start engaging in a risk-based dialogue instead of just looking at a heat map and looking, okay, well, I'm fine with red. And that was it was shocking at the very beginning, but also one of the learning that we're still working on currently to even get better with.
What do you guys think? Are we doing okay on time? Oh, we have a question, yes.
So David, you mentioned that you got your cyber risk function to adopt FAIR. What were the inputs and outputs as they did that?
So we tried everything. We started very granular, focusing on detailed kill chains and threat vectors and whatnot, until we realized, well, that's pretty cool because it allows us to really run a very fast risk quantification, but it doesn't really add value. So over time, obviously, we started to somewhat standardize our approach by really coming from the threat intel perspective, where we say, okay, what is the strategic threat landscape? How does it evolve over time? Typically review it every 3 to 6 months to really understand, hey, are we missing anything? Do we need to prioritize another critical threat against our critical assets? And so we basically tied together threats, critical assets, the control implementation on the critical assets, and the consequences to the business if something goes wrong.
That's a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask you guys, threats, critical, a lot of, in cybersecurity, obviously, when it comes to the efficacy of controls and so forth, people don't always, it goes back to the heat maps, right? Are we doing this, are we doing that? Where do you guys get your information as it relates to threats and the scenarios that you're building within FAIR, industry data-wise? How do you do that and validate that with your FAIR ontology?
Yeah, so we have a real mix, in truth. And I think generally we don't have a really good way of assimilating it into our assessments. But Mastercard have a pretty large threat intelligence team. We have they've got numerous sort of sources. Some are open source, some are sort of related to sort of US, particularly security agencies and so on. And one of the challenges we get is actually getting hold of this data. Often it's, why do you want that? Why do you want to know? And then we have to sort of gild the buy-in, well, actually, we're doing a risk assessment. But over time, again, we don't need to, once we built, it's taken time, but we've built connections with the teams that are gathering threat intelligence internally and leveraging that and building and either including them as SMEs within our assessments to inform our threat event frequency and the threat components of the FAIR model, or what we're trying to do increasingly is build a picture of the typical threat profile for Mastercard, because it's not changing radically. You know, we're not fraud is not such a big issue in the sense that it's easier for people to defraud the banks than the central infrastructure payment service provider. It's really much more focused on sort of nation-state threat actors looking to take down the service because it's critical in 70-odd countries. So that sort of picture we can build up, and we don't need to repeat that. But in truth, we probably do repeat it more often than we should at the moment, and we keep starting from scratch and having to reassess the threat profile based on the information.
What do you think of that?
We just want a quick addition, because we also have a dedicated Fresenius Intelligence Office, which actually does the whole work. I mean, probably it's going to be smaller than yours at Mastercard. But one of the key challenges is also to take those quadrillions of operational signals that we get from our threat intel, from our various tools that we have in place, and even from our third-party vendors that add context to it, and abstract that into a tactical, strategic threat intelligence. And that is something that we're currently just trying to build out to make really meaning of those individual data points that we get, so that we can really understand trends in those threats, because we're still talking about strategic risk scenarios. And as Rob mentioned, our strategic risk landscape will not change drastically overnight if the business model still remains the same.
How are we on time? Good. Okay. I wanted to ask you guys, this is off script a little bit, but I was thinking about this. If you look at the attendee list here, there's all different sizes of companies, right? There's the big guys like you, Mastercard and Fresenius, and you have these teams and so forth. But for somebody out there, or even somebody who's not here, but hypothetically, a CISO who wants to get into this, but doesn't have the budget for a platform or for consulting, how would you tell them to best represent this and to try to get this through so that they can start doing some of this, whether it's at a very low level at least, just to get started, and then obviously learning in time, and getting certified and FAIR and so forth. What's your recommendations?
So I've got one specific piece, which is, and really reflects back to Jack's fantastic analogy around the anatomy and the physiology, and your control standards are your anatomy. If you're mapping control standards, stop doing that now. They're all saying the same thing, and they're only really anyway describing one component of the risk profile. And you're much better deciding on one, or I would say, because I'm on the CRI, use a standard of standards like the CRI that's done the mapping for you, and build. But those standards of standards, or those standards, will just set out what the control requirements are. So you can focus on one. Your starting point should be your FAIR assessment and your risk assessment, and identify what your key scenarios are. Build out a top five threat, top five basically on your threat and your impact, and then you can go back to that decision on one set of standards to sort of help you estimate whether that control environment is effective or not based on those scenarios. So you can't, if you try and test every single control, especially in small organizations, you're not going to have the resources to be able to do that. And that's one of the beauties of FAIR. I always say, you can do a FAIR assessment. I think my record is half an hour, and just obviously not particularly objective one, but it was just quick meeting with someone. Right, let's go through let's put three estimates to these based on just your view. 2 3 months assessments where we bring in control telemetry from our multiple GRC tools, bring in threat intel, bring in our SMEs to estimate their loss. And so you can scale it. You can scale it in not just in the terms of the number of assessments you do. You can scale it in terms of how objective, how detailed you get, and to sort of to quote my boss, who's an ex-general of the U.S. Army, Jen Buckner. He said, "Don't let perfection be the enemy of good enough." You know, we just had a conversation outside preparing for this, talking about risk aggregation and like the dangers of people like getting your fair assessments and start adding up the outputs of it, your risk exposure numbers, to come up with some kind of overall assessment aggregate, which is pretty terrifying to me. Almost as terrifying as you just using heat map, I suppose. But you don't need to. You'll be far better just sacrificing a bit of objectivity for a very, very high level fair assessment of the entire business unit or the entire company, maybe, just because it's still better than a purely compliance-based approach of control assessments, and still better than...
The finger in the air, right?
Exactly.
Anything else on that, David? before we wrap?
I'll just be brief. So just to add context to that, our risk quantification team, our core risk quantification team, isn't that large. So we don't also have the resources to, let's say, have tens of risk analysts doing that. So we started small. We just focused really on what is our value generation inside every of our core business units. What are the most critical assets? Let's start with understanding, let's say, the top threats to them, and maybe focusing on the one, two, or three risk scenarios, and start quantifying them. And again, here the beauty of FAIR is you can also do that on the higher levels. You don't need to go down the whole full path, basically, if you don't have the data points. And maybe one addition that was super helpful for us is also to start setting up kind of a loss event database, because there are incidents out there that are happening or materializing in your environment. So what we did is every major incident, like in the post-incident review phase, we just ask questions like what happened, which controls were deficient, which gives us another data point. And what did it cost us across the various impact dimensions? And that is now data that we have high confidence in, because it really happened to us. And that also was one of the learnings in our healthcare business, or in our, let's say, clinics business, actually. We overestimated our risk significantly, because we were like, okay, if our hospital information system is down, we cannot work anymore. But guess what? It still continues. The physicians know their patients, and they can continue the processes. It takes more time. We have significant response costs, but that is a learning that you can easily establish, because we need to assume a breach in those large organizations that we represent.
Great. Well, it looks like, real quick, any other questions before we wrap here? Okay, I'm sure these gentlemen are available after. So thank you, David. Thank you, Rob. Thank you for this session. We appreciate it.
Thank you.